Bodies all over the ground, necks twisted, faces contorted in terror. SCP-173, not one but an army, scatters out through Site-19, massacring researchers one broken neck at a time. Pure chaos. How could this possibly have happened? The strobing of the blood-red emergency lighting was already fear-inducing enough. So was being hidden under one of the tables in the mess hall, trembling as the noise of alarms rang out through the facility. But the thing about the flickering lights scared SCP Foundation researcher Mira Smithy all the more, were the few seconds of darkness that came between each flash of red. If it had been any other containment breach, she probably wouldn't have even noticed, for in those few seconds, when the warning light lit up only to cut out, she couldn't see a thing, and her not being able to see made it easier for them to move around. Mira had lost track of time since the alarms had first sounded to mark the containment breach. She tried to keep count of the minutes, but the drumming of her heartbeat had thrown her off. There was no way of knowing if it had been hours or only a few minutes since everything went wrong. Of course, the SCP Foundation had plenty of procedures and protocols in place to prevent or respond to situations like this. Yet the emergency alarms kept echoing through the corridors, lights plunging the facility into darkness every few seconds, only to break it up with a brief flash of red. It seemed to Mira from her hiding spot that this breach had proven far too much for the Foundation's extensive procedures to counteract. Maybe it was all over already, she thought after a few seconds, or maybe minutes under the table. What if they had gotten bored, tired of slaughtering their way through Foundation personnel and slunk back to their containment chamber? That would have been simpler, far less terrifying than the alternative that came creeping into Mira's head in the form of her next thought. What if she was the only one left alive, the last member of Site personnel still breathing, just by some random 100-to-1 chance? And if that was the case, how long would it take for them to find her? How many even were there? A new sound, just detectable below the alarms, broke through her avalanche of anxious questions. Footsteps. The noise of boots clomping against the floor, clearly belonging to a human and not one of them. Cautious as to which way her gaze was directed, Mira poked her head from out beneath the table, glancing around during the few seconds where the red of the emergency lights allowed her to see. The steps were getting closer, and as they did, Researcher Smithy realized something that made her fearful for her fellow survivor. They were running away, and there was no way they could do that while also looking back at what was coming after them. "Over here!" she hissed in a hushed tone at the sight of a pair of legs crossing a nearby corridor. Their thick, standard-issue military boots seemed to match those worn by the Foundation's security personnel. The officer passed by, only to stop and tiptoe closer to the mess hall, having heard Mira's whispered call. With the red lights blinking, it looked like every other step the security officer took had been edited out, like they were teleporting closer in the dark. Watching intently from her hiding place, it reminded Mira sickeningly of the things she was hiding from, how they moved, and the worrying fact that she couldn't see one following the security officer. "Hello? Hello?" called a man's voice as he entered the mess hall. "Under the table," Mira whispered. "If we hide, we can still see them, but they can't see us." "Hiding?" he replied. "No, we need something that can revert these things back to the original. It was so much easier to handle when there was just one of them. Look, let's make a break for it. I'm gonna grab SCP-3108 and get the lights back on. If we can restore visibility, we might be able to stand a fighting chance against those things." The officer was looking around the cafeteria, trying to locate the source of Researcher Smithy's voice, eyes distracted. Then the intermittent flickering of red light cut off again, plunging the entire mess hall into near-pitch darkness. At the same time, there was the sound of something heavy and stone scraping against the flooring. It turned Mira's stomach, and she immediately covered her mouth. She had no idea if they could hear her breathing. Could a creature of stone even detect sound at all? While the lights were down and the security guard's back was turned, a pair of sculptures, built from concrete and rebar, traces of spray paint over their stone skin, appeared behind the officer at impossible speed. There was a sickening crunch, followed by the sound of something dropping to the floor of the mess hall. As the emergency lights flicked back on, Mira could see them. The two copies of SCP-173 standing still next to the table she was under, bathed in red light. This nightmare had all begun as an otherwise ordinary Friday for the SCP Foundation. Only a few hours earlier, Mira had been brainstorming her latest pitch for a series of experiments involving SCP-914, otherwise known as the Clockworks. SCP-914 was a large machine comprised of various cogs, gyros, and gears of unknown origin. Its function, however, had long been documented and was of great interest to the Foundation. Any object placed within SCP-914's input booth could be transformed, destroyed, or improved, depending on the Clockworks' setting. Rough would disintegrate the subject, Coarse would dismantle it to its base components, and One-to-One would merely replace the object with a similar, almost identical one. Then there were the fine and very fine settings. The former would cause SCP-914 to improve any item, and the later is capable of the same but with one key difference. Very fine would refine an object even more, usually by giving it anomalous properties. The Foundation higher-ups had permitted staff to freely conduct tests using the Clockworks, although approval was required, and all data was to be recorded. While many of the scientists at the Foundation were fixed on the mysterious origin of SCP-914, or the furthest extent of its refinement capabilities, Myra had been thinking about it in a far more practical way. She wasn't interested in the how or the why of SCP-914's inner workings, nor who had built it. Her experiments were born out of considering better usages for the Clockworks. It was a machine that could provide endless possibilities, and Myra was determined to make it to the fullest use of it in order to solve actual real-world problems. "Imagine for a moment," she announced, reading off her cue cards as she practiced pitching her experiment to the Foundation's senior researchers. "Imagine a world where nobody ever gets sick, where human beings are able to live long, healthy, and prosperous lives. Maybe dial back on the Star Trek." Her colleague, research assistant Jensen, interjected. "Really? That's what you call constructive criticism?" she retorted before continuing. "If we apply the transformative refinement powers of SCP-914, that world could be the future that awaits us. For example, I'm proposing tests that involve placing man-made chemical compounds like painkillers, heart medication, and other potentially life-saving medicines through the Clockworks refinement process. I'm not suggesting we need to set it to very fine and create anomalous versions of these things, but what if, even on the fine setting, we're able to improve the effectiveness of our existing treatments for all kinds of afflictions?" Jensen raised their hand, patiently waiting to comment like a child in a classroom. "What?" Few things," they replied, lowering their hand. "First off, some if not all man-made medications include some kind of organic component. The O5 Council have banned all—" "Yes, I'm fully aware of the containment procedures," Mira interrupted them. "That's exactly why I'm trying to convince the Council, or hell, just even Dr. Bright, to let me step around. I genuinely believe we could be doing so much more with SCP-914, and I need them to see that." "Look, I'm not here to rain on your parade, Smithy," her assistant reassured. "I'm only bringing up concerns that anyone will have about this proposal. You talked about wanting to improve our existing medical treatments, which is noble, don't get me wrong, but have you considered the wider effect that might have? If you make everyone on Earth more resistant or even immune to everything, then diseases are going to evolve. What if we end up with a form of superbacteria resistant to all forms of medication, even if that medicine's been refined in SCP-914? Trying to save the world might just bring about its end." "I've thought about that, but if the Council starts allowing for biological testing again, then the solution is obvious. We use the Clockworks to eradicate whatever germs or diseases are able to develop after improving treatment options," Myra explained, then adding, "Besides, that can't be any more dangerous than what we've been using SCP-914 for. I mean, enhancing other SCPs, that's a recipe for disaster." "Got to agree with you there," Jensen sighed. "Even without placing them in the Clockworks, the Foundation's been way too cavalier with the dangerous ones." "Speaking of, you know what tonight is," Smithy replied with a confused look. "Date night," they stated. Elsewhere in the facility, unknown to researcher Smithy at that time, one of the dangerous SCPs Jensen had mentioned had been let out of containment. This was a regular occurrence, even if it was considered a little unorthodox to some. In fact, the only reason that the O5 Council so often turned a blind eye to it was because of the researcher it involved, Dr. Alto Clef. It seemed Clef had a certain fondness for SCP-173, the sculpture, a living statue constructed from concrete and rebar that could travel at impossible speeds whenever it was unobserved. Most Friday nights, Clef would have romantic candlelit dinners with SCP-173, putting a dress and blonde wig on the sculpture and treating it like his beloved partner. The whole while watched by Dr. Clef and a group of D-Class acting as waiters and cooks, SCP-173 would stand motionless while the bizarre date went on late into the night. It was no secret that the sculpture was a highly aggressive creature, with a penchant for snapping the neck of the nearest person the moment that they blinked. However, it was only because of Dr. Clef's reputation and track record for the elimination of anomalies that he was granted the special privilege of wining and dining with SCP-173. This time though, partway through their regularly scheduled date, Dr. Clef was called away to deal with matters relating to another anomaly he'd been charged with decommissioning. The pair of D-Class waiting on the doctor and his date were instructed to wait, keep a close eye on SCP-173, alerting each other in case they needed to blink. It was a hell of a gamble, a risk that could have been avoided if the sculpture had been transported back to its secure containment chamber. But Dr. Clef could be persuasive. That is to say, he threatened both D-Class waiters with a bludgeoning from his ukulele if they didn't do as he asked. Both the D-Classes stared directly at the sculpture, each one feeling the anxious beads of sweat slowly crawling down their foreheads, worried that they'd both blink at the same time by accident. They announced their need to refresh their eyes every so often, alternating between being the watcher and the one allowed to blink. All the while, SCP-173 was motionless. Perhaps it was patiently waiting for Dr. Clef to return, or for one of the D-Class watching to slip up. As if through some cruel twist of fate, a fly began to buzz through the air, drifting towards the D-Class with their eyes on SCP-173. It looped and darted around, its wings making an annoying droning. One of the waiters announced he needed to blink again, and the other told him he was free to do so while he kept watch over the sculpture. At the exact same moment that one man blinked, the fly zipped its way towards the second D-Class, distracting him again and drawing his gaze for a little more than a millisecond. That fly whizzing past was the last thing he saw. As SCP-173 darted forward, it moved with such incredible speed that it was imperceptible, grabbing the nearby D-Class, the one who'd spotted the fly, and killing him instantly before the other could even open his eyes. When he did, SCP-173 had vanished from its spot at the date night table, nowhere to be seen. Before the remaining D-Class could realize it was behind him, SCP-173 had made short work of its other observer. It began zipping unseen through the corridors of the SCP Foundation facility. Dr. Clef had returned to his date only to find the two D-Class waiters dead, and SCP-173 missing. Immediately, he had raised the alarm, meaning that research staff were too busy fleeing to safely pay any attention to the sculpture quickly making its way through the site. Swept up in the evacuation, half deafened by the alarms, in all the commotion, researcher Myra Smithy hadn't even realized she'd left the door to the Clockworks wide open. Shuffling down a corridor with her fellow researchers, the lights suddenly went out. A few nearby screamed in panic at having been unceremoniously thrust into the dark. Myra blindly reached for Jensen's hand, only to hear the sounds of multiple heavy concrete feet dragging along the floor. Suddenly, the emergency lights blinked. She turned, and to her horror, she saw SCP-173 with its stony arms around Jensen's neck, their face stricken with sheer terror, tears in their eyes. But now Myra quickly realized, as the corridor was filled with shrieks of fear from the other researchers, that there was more than one sculpture now. Myra barely managed to escape with her life in all the confusion, crawling out of the low-lit corridor on her hands and knees, while the multiple new SCP-173 instances slaughtered anyone that couldn't see them. Since then, she had been hiding, hearing the scraping steps of the sculptures traveling around the facility unobserved. They had attacked the fuse boxes first, as if in a calculated tactical move, take out the lights, and suddenly everyone found it much harder to see them. Even through the fear, it was hard for Myra not to blame herself for all the chaos. She couldn't remember whether she'd left the door to SCP-914 open or not, but it hadn't taken her long to figure out that the Clockworks had something to do with this madness. Somehow SCP-173 had made its way there, had been able to operate the machinery while the Foundation staff were distracted by their own evacuation. Presumably, with SCP-914 set to very fine, the sculpture had been transformed into its ultimate refined form, or multiple forms, it seemed. There was a veritable horde of SCP-173s running amok through the facility. It made sense, Myra reasoned, in some twisted, cruel, anomalous way. The sculpture had only ever been a danger when unobserved. The second anyone took their eyes off of it, so much as blinked, it would strike. How does a machine like SCP-914 improve upon that? Easy. It gives the sculpture the power to replicate itself. Anyone can look at multiple things at once, of course, but nobody can look at everything simultaneously. Even if someone was watching a pair or 3 SCP-173s, one more could easily slip up behind them for the kill. Still hidden under the table, Myra's eyes were locked on the pair of sculptures in the mess hall, the body of the security officer out of focus in her peripheral vision. She dared not look away, frozen in sheer fear that the second she blinked, they would lift up the table and find her. She had been so overwhelmed, so paralyzed with her terror, that she had forgotten about the lights. As the emergency lighting flickered again, the sculptures both moved, shifting across the mess hall as the room went dark, only to stop in place the second Myra could see them again. They hadn't gotten closer. In fact, both looked to be leaving. The only thing keeping them here was her. She was watching them, and it had frozen them in place. Their greatest strength, the imperceptible movement and speed of SCP-173, was offset by an indisputable weakness of their anomalous biology. They couldn't stop someone from looking at them, and couldn't stop themselves becoming still, solid concrete when they were being watched. Mulling over her options, Myra decided to follow through with the plan from the fallen security guard, to retrieve SCP-3108 and try to undo what the Clockworks had done. Slowly, she slipped out from under the table, keeping both eyes on the pair of sculptures, keeping them lashed to one spot as she gradually backed out of the mess hall. The lights went out and plunged the area into darkness again, and researcher Smithy could hear the heavy concrete scraping of the 2 sculptures looking for her as she blindly made her way through the facility. She managed to evade the roaming stone creatures, resisting her natural instinct to hide and looking directly at any she encountered on the way, making sure to stay out of their view. If she saw them, she'd freeze them. If they saw her, they'd chase her. Eventually, fishing SCP-3108 out of a containment box, Myra held the weapon in her hand. It was a heavily modified Nerf gun, which she loaded a foam dart into and pulled the plastic slide back. The creatively named Nerfing gun had almost the opposite effect of SCP-914. Instead of improving something, SCP-3108 turned whatever was shot with it into an inferior equivalent object, something worse than itself. It just might work. Drawing the gun as she heard the sound of scraping concrete getting nearer and nearer, Myra turned the corner, coming face to face with one of the sculptures. She held the gun high, closing the gap between them, making sure she didn't miss, but wary she needed to fire before the lights blinked off again. She squeezed the plastic trigger, sending the foam dart shooting out of the barrel of the Nerfing gun. The flimsy projectile collided with the SCP-173 instance, bouncing off its head and landing on the floor. For a split second, the lights dimmed again, then came back on. Myra's heart had lurched in her chest, only to see that the sculpture hadn't moved at all. She leaned closer to it, blinking intentionally. It still didn't move. It was rooted to the ground, fixed. Just a statue, rendered powerless by the Nerfing gun. Excitedly, Myra knelt down and scrabbled on the floor to retrieve the dart, just as the emergency lighting flickered out again. In her excitement, Myra was too focused on reloading SCP-3108. That is, until she heard the shuffling of concrete and rebar behind her. The lights were still out, and she fumbled blindly for the foam dart. As the noise got closer and closer, her fingertips brushed the projectile, knocking it further away, when suddenly the lights came back up. But as she reached for it, researcher Smithy felt a large, cold presence behind her, something huge and heavy, and made of stone and lingering at the very corner of her eye. Before she could turn around and face it, something grabbed Myra, and a sickening snap rang out through the corridor. Now go check out SCP-096 vs. SCP-173, and SCP-173 Origin Story: How 173 Got to Site-19. Just be careful not to blink.